Okay, so you're John Clark, and you're an engineer, right?
Used to be an engineer.
Used to be an engineer.
Yeah.
And you went through a transition. You had an awakening.
Correct. While I was studying for my PhD in transpersonal psychology, I backed into a process of awakening that ultimately, over 6 years, transpired into a full state of enlightenment. It's funny how I stumble on the words as soon as there's a video going.
So is this like the Buddha sitting under a tree and contemplating for years and suddenly you awaken, or was your process different?
Oh, for me, the process of getting a degree, an advanced degree in psychology, especially in transpersonal psychology, which is a field where it studies extraordinary human experiences, is a lot of practice therapy, where you actually do therapy on each other, which means that you address within yourself real issues that you have, issues that come up, and ultimately you work on those in class. So after 2.5 years of that, doing some somatic therapies that are designed to produce results in a half an hour that potentially 10 years of talk therapy won't solve, I ended up working through a lot of personal issues that I had, and issues like everybody else has that are specific to them. So I was becoming more and more knowledgeable about my own self, my own reasons for doing things, my own motivations and my own goals. And ultimately, when I found that last piece of the puzzle, I bounced into this entirely new space, which is much more expansive than the experiential existence that I had grown up with and typically is everybody's reality. And it wasn't something I sought after, and it wasn't something that I even thought was a good idea once I learned what this whole enlightenment business was about. I thought it was actually a really dumb idea. And then suddenly I found myself in the middle of a process that I had to work my way through.
Wait, why would enlightenment be dumb? I mean, everyone wants it. Everyone tries to get to it, and yet here you were saying the exact opposite.
Well, it's because for an unknown, this idea that you become an expression of love and that you love everybody, for an unknown, you're willing to give up everything that you've come to be. And I didn't understand why somebody would give up the proverbial bird in the hand for two in the bush because someone else said it's better, and that you just have to trust me on faith that it's better. That's my canned answer. My other answer was before I knew anything about the subject, my new love interest. I never really loved anyone like I fell in love with this person. And she said enlightenment was loving everybody the same. And I knew how I felt about her, and I could feel how she felt about me. And I thought, I want to share this with anybody. Why would I want to be a loving presence to everybody? I just want to love this one person and my kids. And so that was my initial motivation. But the more I found out about it, the more I realized you're giving up everything you've come to be, everything that you think you are, including your hopes, dreams, aspirations. All of that ceases to matter, and a new set of thoughts come in, or a new set of ways of being come in that you don't know what they are until you let go of what was, or until it's basically forcibly wrenched from your hands. And that's why I thought it was a dumb idea. Is why did you seek out a transformation because other people said it's useful? And the odds in success are probably worse than the odds of winning the lottery. And so why devote an entire life to the pursuit of something that was highly unlikely to happen? I didn't realize if I wanted to avoid the experience, my first mistake was actually not wanting it. Because those who desire awakening are a lot less likely to awaken than those who don't. And that's the paradox, because if you don't pursue it, it's not going to happen. And I pursued an awakening in a roundabout way, and that is by understanding my own personal story well enough that it became exactly what it is, and that's a story. And once I understood the story completely, you bounce outside of it like a quantum step. There is no transitioning through the boundaries of your story or the boundaries of your existence as you've defined it. You are suddenly outside the story because you know it intimately enough and thoroughly enough that you understand it's, by its very nature, is just one of an infinite number of possibilities for the essence that you have been since you were born. And so what I didn't understand is it isn't an arrival. It's the start of a progression or an acceleration of personal growth that really has no description from an experiential point of view. It's the pace is lightning fast. It's overwhelming. It's tiring, and you're dealing with a constant fear and terror of non-existence because you've moved into this space where you can't define yourself. Every moment that you experience slips away into the past as if it's happened to somebody else. And that's frightening. And then as you get more connected with what it actually means, it's literally terrifying. And so until you move further through the process, literally the terror of non-existence is with you all the time. And then on top of that, there's this sadness of not fully appreciating the self that existed before that had to disappear for this new essence, or not new essence, but this essence of yourself to come forward. And so there's a grieving process for the quality of the person that brought you to the point of awakening that you could never fully appreciate until after awakening, and then by then it's too late. It's like losing a relative and that you love dearly and never actually telling them the depth of your feelings. And we typically do that with ourselves. We don't acknowledge the depth of our feelings for our own self, like somehow it should be obvious that we care about ourselves. But in fact, ultimately, we're harder on ourselves than anyone else. And so it's a fascinating experience now that I'm looking at it from having progressed through it. But it's not for the faint of heart, and it's not simple to get through. And it's got a level of suffering involved in it that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Outside of that, there's a whole lot of love and light involved, and an expansive perspective, and the colors, everything's brighter around you. You feel connected with everything. So I don't want to say that the process isn't well worth the price of admission, but the price is actually very high. So that's why I thought it was a dumb idea, is I understood a lot of this stuff intuitively before I entered into the process, and that's because of that understanding. I didn't seek it out at all. It just happened because I understood my own story well enough that I could no longer see it as anything other than a story. Another way that I can describe it, which I think is interesting, is what you do is if your mind or your set of experiences is like a metropolitan area or a city, an urban area, then what you do is you go through and you renovate all the buildings. You make sure that every structure you have in this urban area is well connected by a well repaired road. And when everything is renovated inside and out and well connected to every other structure, then at that point it's like you get hit by an earthquake and everything crumbles. And what your job then to do is essentially sweep away all the rubble and find the natural parkland of existence that was there before the first structure was built. And I tend to like that analogy too, because the level of destruction that I felt through the process was significant and profound, and my progression through the process was like cleaning up the mess. Probably not your white-robed spiritual presentation of the experience, but But I think for a Western mind, it's a lot more workable than many of the things you hear, like drop the illusion and step outside of the dream and all these other things that discount the fact that illusion and that dream is everything that you are and everything that you've ever thought you are. And you're attempting to drop that in favor of a belief that there's something better on the other side. But you don't know the truth of that until you get there. And so the answer is yes, there is something better on the other side. But it's challenging. And most people, in my experience, think they've gone through something and they actually are just getting indications of the direction they're headed, and they need to step back, relax, not really think they're in any place, and just allow the future and where they're at to unfold.
Well, that's what I find so interesting about your account, because in Western culture, we live in this dualistic spiritual mindset of, seek the light, avoid the darkness, or try to go to heaven instead of hell, however, whichever religion you want to choose. And what you're basically saying is, in order to get to heaven, you have to go through hell.
Absolutely. There's no doubt. And the Bible actually makes reference to that with Jesus' 40 days out in the desert, or whatever it is. I might be totally trashing the story, but he does mention that basically he went through hell, or went to hell, however he put it, and that's every process is like that. And if you talk to somebody that's enlightened, they will tell you the same thing. And they're all different paths. I used to have a URL or an email address called footpaths.com, and because it is a footpath, there's never will be a major highway to enlightenment. It's an individual process, yet everybody arrives at exactly the same place, and the stories of the journey along the way have a similar dynamic to where it's essentially the same. And that's what allows one person to teach another about the experience, and to acknowledge or recognize certain stages along the way that help a person know that they're on the right path. Eventually, when you get to what I would call the halfway point, then you're not pushing it so much as you're just continuing to face in the right direction and being pulled the rest of the way. So there is help along the way at a certain point, but you have to persevere through the first half of it, which is like running marathon after marathon. And you collapse over the finish line of one, and you look up and see the starting line of another with no time for rest. It's like climbing a mountain where there is no place to pitch a tent on the side of the cliff. You just have to keep climbing until you get to the top.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about how the process works, because I've always thought of spiritual people or mystics or seekers being two kinds. The first kind is, you've already described it, as sort of the love and light crowd. Joy, joy, happy, happy. I'm going to sing at the top of my lungs at how wonderful it is, but I'm going to stay away from the darkness. If you bring any darkness into my vicinity, then I don't want any part of it. And it's valuable, I think, to have those people, but at the same time, they're not always able to reach down to those who are going through difficult times and who are engaged in dysfunctional behaviors, because they're trying to stay away from those. And so then you get the other type who go through this very destructive, dysfunctional process, and they come out the other side and end up as these people sort of like yourself who can be in the love and light, but they also know the dark side, and so they can integrate it into themselves.
Well, what I'm saying actually is the actual process has the darkness I described in it. And if anybody talks about a process that's just love and light and doesn't have any of the darkness, I would use the psychological term spiritual bypass. Is they are putting a cap over that which they don't want to face, and adopting this new egocentric approach to life that seems a lot more functional and makes them more comfortable. So the reason that they can't be in the presence of any of that dark energy, so to speak, is specifically because it threatens to pick the scab off the wound that they went ahead and covered up. And in true awakening, nothing is left covered. Everything is exposed, examined, looked at, and aligned with everything else, so that you become a complete individual. There are no more fragments. So if somebody talks about just the love and light and never alludes to any of the balance with the difficult aspects of the process, then they're likely engaging in some form, however sophisticated or not, of spiritual bypass. And you can see some very advanced spiritualists that ultimately find out later on in life that there were a whole number of issues that they used their spirituality to create a cover for, so that they never have to visit it again. And that's not a true awakening. You can have all the fabulous spiritual experiences you want. However, they don't have the true depth of meaning of a spiritual experience that has the complete context, the complete perspective. It's essentially manufactured. And so I do call them the love and light crowd, and the ones that are more purposely doing what they do instead of well-intentioned, those I call spiritual salesmen.
Well, that's one of the terms I've come up with, capitalist spirituality, where a person who is in the love and light crowd, they're trying to almost sell themselves on it.
Yes. And they do form a useful function, because even if the depth of their understanding has a certain hollow nature to it, they can lead somebody, they can point somebody in the right direction on the path, because a lot of what they're describing is in fact what you can find out from textbooks on how to be in general. But the thing is let's say you look at Jesus, who I think in a lot of circles is recognized as an enlightened individual. He didn't seek out just the people that would believe how he does. He sought out the tax collectors, and he sought out the people that weren't doing well, and because those are the ones that needed his attention, not the ones that were ready to follow him at the drop of a hat. And so he had plenty of followers, but that isn't who he was really trying to find. He was trying to find the people that had become completely disenfranchised, completely lost, completely self-serving, and tell them there's a better way.
And I think that's also one of the reasons why we have the self-help industry and so many life coaches and therapists. They're trying to reach out to those people who have, in a sense, lost their way. And what I found is it's kind of hard to be an effective life coach if you haven't been there and experienced this function yourself.
Well, you can't. And so the process isn't dysfunctional. What's dysfunctional is this idea that you can have a process a transformational process that doesn't include pain and suffering. It is part of the process, and when you talk to somebody that believes that all you have to do is engage in love and life, or love and light, that's a small side effect of the actual process of expanding your perspective and standing outside your particular set of experiences that you had in this life.
It's almost like looking through a keyhole, looking at all the light coming through the keyhole while trying to ignore the darkness surrounding you if you back away from the keyhole.
Well, I like that analogy, because what's interesting is that what people do is they have their eye pressed up to the keyhole, and they can see, it's like looking at the world through a straw. They can see some possibilities, but they ignore the fact that they're locked in a dark room. But in fact, they're actually not locked in a dark room. They're holding themselves in that dark room. And I mean, that's both true and not true. But the only person that has a key to that locked room is the person themselves. There isn't anybody else that's going to let them out, no matter what the promise is. And ultimately, if they see enough of that light through the hole, they think that they're the ones that are going to let other people out of the rooms that they've confined themselves to, which in fact isn't true. And that's why you have a lot of self-help gurus that, for the right price, will sell you the secret to unlocking that door. And so they're claiming to hold the key, and they don't. You just the actual process is to give somebody the tools they need to fashion their own key in the way that makes sense to them. And that's not something that anybody outside another individual can do for a person. They can only hand them the information that they need, which is going to be specific to each individual. Hand them the information they need to progress forward, and ultimately, hopefully, unlock that door and see the full extent of the light that's available, and not just what filters in through a keyhole.
Well, it strikes me as very interesting that what the keyhole metaphor illustrates really is any small hole close up seems like the entire world. And when you are looking at the entire world through a keyhole, you don't realize it's a keyhole.
Right.
But it's only when you back away from it that you see the darkness around the keyhole that you realize it's a keyhole. And I found that the people who I think are most interesting and have the most depth they've seen the darkness and they've experienced that. But they also see the keyhole, and now they are just saying, I want to unlock the keyhole. But those who have never experienced any darkness, any dysfunction, they don't even know that the keyhole is what they're looking through.
And ultimately, that darkness you speak of is referred to in the Bible as the long dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
And or the journey through the valley of the shadow of death is that you lose that story. And it's interesting you mentioned, like taking the analogy further, is there's a card that in the Osho deck of tarot cards, it shows a small child standing in front of a gate, very close to a gate with bars on it, and wanting to open it, but looks and sees it chained shut. The idea is that if you take a step back and see the gate from a broader perspective, you notice that chain isn't locked, that you can easily unravel it yourself because there isn't a lock on it. And so that's the same thing as what you're saying with the keyhole analogy, is you have to step back and see how limited the view is with your eye pressed up against that keyhole compared to finding a way to open that door and step outside the constraints that you've placed around yourself.
And that's where I think the analogy gets very interesting, because, as you said, a spiritual teacher can show you the keyhole, show you the key, teach you how to make a key. There are all kinds of keys, but there's only one key that fits that keyhole, and you have to be the one to put it in the keyhole and open it. And they can't do it for you.
The sticking point for nearly everybody is the fact that you actually have to be willing to take a step back and acknowledge the darkness that you exist in, and be okay with that before you can open that door. And that's where everybody falls in their face, is they're unwilling to face the threat and taking that step back and see how bankrupt this linear existence, as I call it, with one experience after another, how bankrupt it actually is, and how limited a view that it gives you. And when you start seeing things more expansive, it's like you take the straw down away from your eye and you see everything, and everything's brighter, the colors are more vibrant, and life becomes infinitely more interesting than it was before. And yet, in your previous existence, you thought that's all there was, and in fact, it's one of the most limited views possible. But like the famous psychologist said, Jack Engler, says you have to become somebody before you can become nobody. So part of our goal is to develop as individuals until we come into our own selves in early adulthood, and then we have the opportunity to step outside that story. But until we define some story in itself, there is no story to step outside of, and that's a social and physiological development that happens all the way into our early 20s.
Well, that's kind of why I met you and started talking to you, because you had a story. You had great success. You worked your way up. You became a successful engineer, multimillionaire, and then it all stopped.
Yes. It all stopped with backing into a process. So I basically lost everything. The finances were just a small part of it, but marriage, relationship with everybody, family, kids, all of that. So I had to start over from scratch and rebuild everything, but not the way it was before, and not success by force or excess by legislating that I was going to be successful, but allowing the future to unfold in a way that felt natural, and yet I was still productive and connected with the experience that I had. And for me, once I entered into this process of awakening, after I got to the halfway point, it was pretty obvious when I was moving off track. I would pick a direction that wasn't fruitful, and I would go from what felt like a fast sprint to trying to work my way through molasses. And so all progress would just come to a grinding halt. And so I learned very quickly to notice the signs of not moving in a correct direction, or a direction that was going to work ultimately. And so now for the last couple of years, everything's been clicking. And then this year, I realized a final transition that the insight came to me in December 2011. And in first week in May of 2013, I realized that insight, as I call it, and began to live it, and everything changed. And so from being able to discuss clarity to being able to experience clarity and have complete clarity was really fascinating. And I spent at least 2 months just looking at everything I was doing and laughing, going, well, that's new. So there's virtually nothing has remained unchanged from there, and yet I was already nearly 6 years into a process. The idea that something that profound would happen from the realization of an insight so late kind of surprised me. But it's like a last final individual transformation or manifestation of an insight that I think is responsible for the magnitude of the change.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about magnitude, because most people who are seekers of enlightenment go on pilgrimages, they go to holy sites, they try to have massive things happen in their life to have a massive impact. So it's like a linear process there. And you work the exact opposite way. Little tiny changes in your perception or in your life have massive impact over a period of months and years.
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating that way, because what'll happen is you follow an intuitive path, which you get very used to recognizing, and pieces fall into place that you're not even really aware of how they add up, and then one small piece of information will come in and it just brings everything together in a whole, and suddenly there's a before and after. And that's a transition that occurs, a transition of insight that in itself is profoundly affecting. But when you come to understand something, its presence in the world takes time to unfold, because your body, everything you are, represents where you've come from. and it's only in time that you actually represent the new insight. And for me, it took a couple of releases over the failure of my second marriage and some underlying body-held anger that I was unaware of, and then also the positives, the things that I missed about that marriage. That those were the keys. Those were the last deeply held body attachments that I had that I didn't even know about. And for body-held attachments, there are specific sequences of events that uncover them, and once you see it, it no longer has control over you, and it just evaporates. It's like you release it. So that's what was the final piece in manifesting this insight that I had in December 2011. What's kind of fascinating about that is I transitioned from being able to say I am an expression of love, which is dual in nature, to I am love, and everything I do is an expression of love, which is a singularity, to be able to say I am love. And the difference from an energetic point of view is that I was always not always, but connected through this experience with this energetic flow that was like a raging river, like a big pipe that with this raging energy in it. And the closer I got to that energy, the more information I had, and the more connected I was with everything. But it was always pretty overwhelming. And so what I ultimately did through that insight was, all of a sudden I took a step into the center of that flow without crossing any boundaries, and suddenly I was inside it, and that raging energy was all around me, instead of me being outside it and deciding how close I wanted to get to it. And it's remained that way ever since December of 2011. But actually coming to terms with that, and understanding what it means, and making that a part of my life, and manifesting that, that ended up taking nearly a year and a half.
Well, you've described the effect on your perception as resembling, to some extent, the movie Limitless, where the character played by Bradley Cooper takes a drug and suddenly has intense clarity about everything.
Yeah, the experience itself is a lot like in that movie, except that 4-digit IQs don't exist. But it's really fascinating, because the way they depict it in the movie, everything gets brighter from being dull. There's absolute clarity. Little pieces of information add up to coherent conversation that's entirely appropriate for the moment. I mean, all of that stuff is exactly like being enlightened. It's really kind of fascinating, and you do have the ability to process enormous amounts of information and come to real conclusions about things. It's just that unlike